from America's finest city. This is Real Talk San Diego on ESPN 1700.
What's happening, gang? You are back live in the Secret Stash. Tracking down, some of the coolest local people? Like to believe that's the case here. Talking about some important local stuff for sure. Who knows? Maybe catching a story or two in the process with the singular goal of leaving you a little better than how we found you. I'm your co-host. I'm your host, actually. Co-hosted today by Michelle Paul, Real Talk Radio San Diego. I'm actually the co-founder, which is where I was going with that, of the Greenhouse Group, located right down here in the heart of San Diego, gang. We're helping folks move into and out of homes and move in that process with a little bit of purpose. You want to find out a little bit more about who we are and what we do, go down to our website at thegreenhousegroupinc.com. And Michelle, I already kind of lofted you up there. Apparently you're co-hosting today. That just happened, huh?
Hey, that sounds good to me.
Your impact must be such that just overcame me. And now we're splitting fiddle today. So Michelle Paul is owner of the law office of Michelle Paul. You can, by the way, catch her out at sandiego-divorcelaw.com. Now, here's the reason why we got Michelle in the studio today. First of all, she's kind of a big deal, but we'll just let her get to that about herself in a second. Secondly, in our domain of helping folks move into and out of homes, there's the big three, right? The big three no one wants to talk about. It's the divorce, death, and then disability. And the three have a tendency to move around stuff when they happen. And right now we're noticing in our practice, in our little community, that a lot of folks bump into this thing that no one really planned on when you got into the conversation in the first place with your loved one, your forever one. And then next thing you know, you accumulated some stuff along the way. Who knows, maybe some family, maybe some assets. And then you find yourself in that crossroads. The spouse that you signed up for along this journey ended up switching it on you, or maybe vice versa. You're switching it on them. And now you've got a conversation to have that you didn't really plan on having. And Michelle, I appreciate you for being in the studio today. But for your fans, why don't you do a better job at me at explaining who you are and what we do so we can set the context a little bit.
Thank you. And, before we get going, too, I just really appreciate you having me on the show. It's a thrill to be here this morning.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Appreciate you hanging out.
We get many calls on a given day, and people will call because they find themselves, as you say, in a situation they never thought in a million years they'd find themselves in. Yeah. And here we are fielding questions and many questions every day. And so people will ask, what do I do? And so what I'll do is say, or, I'll have our office who are answering the calls, they'll say, well, tell me what's going on. And we'll ask for a timeline. Yeah. And we'll say, when did it all start? And, even going back before even the marriage, how long did you date for? So it gives us an idea of the buildup of the relationship and how it started and how it got to where it is now. And then, like you said, filling in the blanks. Did they acquire a house in between all this? Did they acquire the kids? We have people that fight over who gets the dog. So
that's usually the first child, let's be honest.
Yeah, and it's there more than you think. So here we are, and what I like to tell
probably more loyal than both the parents put together.
Yeah.
But by the way, gang, and this is obviously one of those conversations that no one likes to have, but the truth is that we need to have more of it, because if the stats say, and I don't know, you probably know the stats better than I do, but it's a really high failure rate with divorces, is there not?
From what my experience, or and actually my experience, I'm a member of the club, unfortunately, at one time, but from my experience and my research, there's about 50%.
Yeah. And
with the economy, obviously, and you're the real estate guru here in the room, but with the economy the way it is, there is an influx or deflux depending on whether, the house is going to sell or not. So when the houses start rising, the divorces start rising. It's kind of an interesting concept.
Wow, I've never heard that before. That's an interesting corollary. I bring up that context because this is the safe zone. This is the safe tree, like old school. I forget the quote, but this is the friendly tree, right, where we can talk about this type of stuff. And this conversation is also happening live right now. We're streaming on the Meerkat app. You can follow us live at Follow the Stash. That's actually our Twitter handle, by going onto the Meerkat app. And you can ask Michelle any question you might have live. You can stay anonymous, though, because no one knows anybody's Twitter handle, right? So it'll be a good opportunity to get some sage wisdom from Michelle in the studio. But Wanted to talk about this concept in a very specific light, Michelle, and this is the reason why we got you specifically on the show is because your approach to this conversation, I think, is very unique. One of the things that I've noticed, I guess, about your approach is that, it's like, it's almost like divorce law out of the courts. It's like, and I'd love to hear you put your own take on this, but the way that resonates with me is it's like taking control, because once the process goes to the courts, that's the exact abduction of control, is it not?
True.
Yeah. So say more about that, like that concept of where you see yourself in this conversation.
I want to say when people do call in and they are getting that consultation, the initial consultation, and they're everything's up in the air, their lives are upside down, they're like, it's a, look, one of the first questions that I do ask them is there a way that we can work this out before you even file the paperwork? And they, boy, some of them scratch their head, or some of them already know right away. Heck no, it's done. So, that's a good barometer, because now I know kind of where to guide them.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting thread. It's almost like, I feel like we could probably spend the entirety of the show just talking about that element alone, because I don't know about you. You're definitely the one who's going to speak on behalf of both of us in this capacity. I've only bumped into several of my friends so far that have, unfortunately gone through this process already. I'm sure as the years go on, that number will only grow. But usually in retrospect, there's always a different perspective, right? It's like when they're going in the heat of it, it's very emotional. It's raging anger. It's somebody got over on somebody else. Somebody got wrong. There's sides that are taken. There's the ego, and the face of the whole thing just gets so bolstered up out of control that it's almost impossible to see your race from the runner anymore, right? And so I'm curious about that. Like, so what type of techniques can you employ early on, like swimming furthest upstream as possible to meet them where they're at when it's all shrouded in emotion to actually affect a change?
Information is key. And like you're saying, the hindsight is always 20/20. But information is key. And, that is one of the things that I do say to them. I say to them, a year from now, how are you going to look back on this, and what decisions were you, in the decisions that you did make? Try to put it yourself even 5 years from now and go, okay, how should I have handled that? And it really, they do come back and they say it works. What do I tell them as far as keeping it out of the courts? Information's key. So I do say, look, let's say they're in the house right now, because a lot of the calls we get, they're still living in the house with the spouse. And they're like, once I file, it's all going to hit the fan. And it's like, well, yes, of course. And there's either a...
Oh, that's interesting. Let me pause real quick.
Sure.
So what I'm hearing you say is that a lot of times it's like incoming, like the other spouse doesn't even know. Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow. I guess that makes sense after hearing you say that, but I always kind of just imagine that everybody sort of knows what's going on, and it's sort of a...
idealistic situation.
Yeah, very idealistic, perhaps. I'm Pollyannic about it.
We even have, sometimes the spouse will call us and they're not represented. So if they're not represented, we actually can speak to the spouse until they lawyer up. So I'll get the call from the opposing spouse, and it's like, what's going on? And it's like, oh my gosh. So you're calling me for the information, so I got to lay it out to them. Yeah. So what do you do with that other than, so again, how do you keep it out of the courts? Before they leave the house, I always tell them, look, before we even file, because you got 30 days. You have 30 days to actually serve the other side when you file. So I say, look, even though we do all the paperwork now,
interesting,
get your ducks in a row, get your information, get your, one of the main things is get your financials, get your bank account statements, get copies of all that stuff. Because once you leave the house, or once they leave the house, there's information you're not going to be able to retrieve once that initial split happens.
Wow, we're getting into this already. This is some good stuff. Wow, so there's actually like a little, I don't want to call it a cooling off period, because that's a totally different way of thinking about it, but that's another element to it, kind of as well, right? Like, you can go do the thing, like, actually initiate the thing, and then there's actually 30 days until you actually have to let the other party know.
Yes.
So that's an interesting concept, too. Like, do you ever, I'd imagine you probably counsel people to say, okay, look, we did it. You feel good about that? Like, we did that. And then now that you've done it, see what's true. Like doing the act sprinkles some truth on it, does it not? To make sure this is really what you want to follow through with.
Oh, yeah. It's and everybody is in their own timeline, and everybody's at their own stage. So, like you're saying, it's not a cookie cutter kind of situation. So, I could just draw on all these different divorces that we're handling right now.
Yeah.
And,
please do. Please do.
Really?
We love stories in the stash.
I mean, I've got a situation where, and people don't think about this a lot with divorce, but there's domestic violence tied into this sometimes. And I don't want to bring, bummer summer down.
No, it's true.
But, like, for example, I've got a situation where the spouse is deathly afraid to just do he doesn't want to file yet, but yet he wants to get the process going because he knows once that happens, he can't afford to move out of the house. So he's afraid because if he moves out of the house, he's got to find another place, and that's going to be expensive. And so, B, if he does move out of the house, he's afraid what's going to happen. And so, with that said, one of the things that people really have to think about also when they are going through this process is the status quo has to be sustained. The courts will say just because you're leaving the house doesn't mean you can just give up your mortgage or give up paying the bills. You're still responsible as a community to pay 50-50 for all those bills and the debts.
Which is also another reason why bankruptcy is often tied to this process, is it not?
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't studied the stats on that, but it seems like those two sometimes go hand in hand.
Yeah, yes, and it's kind of bizarre. Recently, I haven't had to deal with too much bankruptcy. Usually by the time that I get involved with their case, there's another bankruptcy attorney involved, so that part of it's being handled, yes.
So already, usually that's further upstream than the divorce itself.
Right.
Bankruptcy first.
Well, like you said, there's a lot of preparation involved, especially when you're dealing with the house issues. I mean, there's a lot of paperwork and a lot of history involved. And finances are all tied into it.
So more times than not, they actually do the money thing first, and then they handle the relationship thing.
That's the smart thing. It really
really
is. Well, it's, and that's what I tell people too. Look, while you're going through this emotional process, let me be your business manager because you are not going to be able to think clearly. And while you're going through this, let me do this for you. Let me be that wall that before anything hits you, it'll hit me. So it'll protect you, put a barrier around you. So.
Gang, can you tell why we got Michelle Paul in the house for the stash? This is exactly the kind I'm digging this right now.
Cool.
This is you might say, sort of a unique approach to an age-old conversation. Probably as old as time itself. People getting together and then splitting up. I mean, I'd imagine back in the caveman days, you'd split up tools or rocks or habitats or alcoves, out of the. But nowadays, man, integrated complexity to the actual tilt. And so, hanging out in the studio today with Michelle Paul, owner of Law Office of Michelle Paul. You can catch her, by the way, at sandiego-divorcelaw.com. Or you got a couple phone numbers, too. Toll free, 800-590-4305. Again, if you're writing this down, it's 800-590-4305. And streaming live on the Meerkat app. What more do you want, Michelle?
Not much more than this.
I'll tell you what. We got one more thing coming up, and that is, what is the number one rule in this conversation about what not to do? So Stash Nation, hang out. We'll be right back with Michelle Paul, Law Office of Michelle Paul, Real Talk Radio San Diego.
Are you really going to ask me that on the air?